There was a city that the ancient world believed could never die. Its name was Rome. And for 8 centuries, that belief seemed reasonable. Perhaps even obvious. Rome had been the organizing principle of the known world for so long that imagining its absence was like imagining the sun failing to rise. It was simply there, massive, eternal, inevitable. Its roads stretched like the veins of some great organism across 3 continents, carrying soldiers and merchants and ideas and diseases from the cold northern forests of Britain to the burning sands of the Sahara, from the Atlantic coast of Iberia to the reed marshes of Mesopotamia. 40,000 miles of paved road. The largest infrastructure project the ancient world had ever produced. And along those roads flowed the lifeblood of civilization itself. At its height, Rome had fed 1 million people within a single city. 1 million. In a world where most settlements numbered in the hundreds, where a town of 10,000 was considered remarkable, Rome was something that defied comprehension. It had aqueducts that carried fresh mountain water into the city at a rate that modern engineers still find astonishing, over 1 million cubic meters per day, flowing through 11 separate systems, some of them stretching more than 90 kilometers across the Italian landscape. It had sewers. It had hospitals. It had a postal system that could carry a message from Rome to the eastern frontier in under 2 weeks. It had libraries, public baths, amphitheaters, markets, schools. It had, in short, everything that we now call civilization, and it had built these things when much of the world was still living in wooden huts. And then it ended. Not cleanly. Not with a single dramatic moment that the world could point to and say, "There. That is where everything changed." History rarely offers such clarity. Instead, Rome ended the way that great things usually end, through a long accumulation of small failures, each one manageable on its own, each one made worse by the ones before it, until one day the structure that had seemed eternal was simply no longer there. The signs had been visible for generations. The empire's borders, those vast, impossible borders, had grown too long to defend. The Rhine and the Danube formed a natural frontier in the north and east, but natural frontiers only hold when you have the soldiers and the will to defend them. By the 3rd century, Rome was struggling on both counts. The legions that had once been the terror of the known world were increasingly made up of soldiers recruited from the very peoples they were supposed to keep out, Germanic warriors fighting for Roman pay, loyal to their commanders rather than to the abstract idea of Rome, willing to switch sides when a better offer appeared. The treasury was empty. Or rather, it was never empty. It was constantly refilled through taxation and conquest. But the costs of maintaining the empire had grown faster than the revenues that paid for it. Emperors responded the way that desperate governments always respond: they debased the currency. The silver denarius, the coin that had been the backbone of Roman commerce for centuries, was quietly, steadily hollowed out. In the time of Augustus, it was nearly pure silver. By the 3rd century, it was barely 2% silver, a thin coating of precious metal over a core of cheap bronze. Prices rose. Trade contracted. Farmers who had once produced surpluses for distant markets retreated into subsistence agriculture, growing just enough to feed their families and pay their taxes, if they could manage even that. And from beyond the borders, the pressure was building. They came from the east first. Not the Visigoths. Not the Vandals. Not any of the Germanic peoples whose names would eventually become synonymous with the fall of Rome. They came before all of those, a people so ferocious, so alien to everything the settled world understood, that their arrival did not merely threaten Rome. It set the entire western half of the Eurasian continent in motion. The Huns. No one in the Roman world had seen anything like them. They were nomadic horsemen from the Great Steppe, that vast, flat, treeless ocean of grass that stretches from Hungary to Manchuria, and they fought in ways that Mediterranean soldiers had never encountered and could not effectively counter. They did not stand and face you in a line. They did not build fortifications or establish supply lines or follow any of the rules that made ancient warfare comprehensible. They moved like a storm. They appeared from nowhere, loosed volleys of arrows from horseback at distances that made conventional combat impossible, and disappeared before a counterattack could be organized. Their composite bows, layers of wood and bone and sinew laminated together under enormous tension, could punch through Roman armor at ranges that Roman archers could not match. When the Huns swept westward across the steppe in the 370s, they did not conquer the Germanic peoples in their path so much as they detonated them. The Visigoths, a Christian people who had been settled along the Danube frontier for decades, farming, trading, gradually absorbing Roman ways, found themselves suddenly, desperately homeless. They sent emissaries to the Roman Emperor Valens with an extraordinary request: permission to cross the Danube and settle within the empire. They would serve as soldiers. They would provide labor. They would be good subjects. They just needed to get away from the Huns. Valens agreed. And in 376 AD, something happened that had never happened before in Roman history. An entire people, perhaps 200,000 men, women, and children, crossed the Danube and entered the empire not as conquered subjects but as refugees seeking protection. What followed was a catastrophe of Roman making. The officials tasked with organizing the resettlement were corrupt. The food that was supposed to be provided to the Visigoths was sold instead, diverted into private pockets while the refugees went hungry. When the Visigoths protested, Roman soldiers responded with contempt and then with violence. And the Visigoths, who were, let us remember, a warrior people who had crossed the most dangerous frontier in the ancient world, responded in kind. Within 2 years they were at war with Rome. And in 378 AD, at a place called Adrianople, in what is now northwestern Turkey, they destroyed a Roman army. The Emperor Valens himself was killed. His body never recovered, lost somewhere in the chaos of that catastrophic defeat. Adrianople was not the end. But it was a wound that never properly healed. The empire limped on. There were capable emperors still. Theodosius managed to stabilize the east, reaching a settlement with the Visigoths that gave them land in the Balkans in exchange for military service. But the principle had been established, the precedent set: armed peoples could force concessions from Rome. And Rome, increasingly, could not stop them. Enter Alaric. He was a Visigoth nobleman who had served in the Roman army, had fought for Rome, bled for Rome, watched his soldiers win victories that Roman generals claimed the credit for. He was ambitious, politically astute, deeply frustrated by what he saw as Rome's failure to honor its obligations to his people. He wanted a formal command in the Roman military, a title, recognition. He wanted to be part of the system rather than a threat to it. Rome refused. The Senate, that ancient institution that had survived every crisis in 8 centuries of Roman history, looked at this Germanic chieftain and his demands and responded with the particular arrogance of an institution that has forgotten that its power rests on something other than tradition. They would regret it. Alaric marched on Rome not once but 3 times. The first 2 sieges ended in negotiations, enormous payments of gold and silver and silk and pepper, ransoms so vast they stripped the city's treasuries and left the Senate melting down the statues of the gods to make up the weight. After the second siege, a Roman senator asked the negotiators what the Visigoths would leave the Romans if they took everything. The answer came back without hesitation: your lives. The third siege, in August of 410 AD, ended differently. The gates of Rome opened, whether through treachery or simple exhaustion, the ancient sources disagree, and for 3 days, Alaric's Visigoths moved through the streets of the Eternal City. They took what they wanted. They burned some buildings. They killed some people. By the standards of ancient warfare, it was not particularly brutal. Alaric had given orders that churches were to be respected, that those who sought sanctuary were not to be harmed. But that almost made it worse, because it demonstrated, with terrible clarity, that Rome could be sacked and the world would not end. That the city which had called itself eternal was just a city after all. The news spread across the empire like a shockwave. Saint Jerome, living in Bethlehem, received word and could not write for days. Augustine, the brilliant theologian who was Bishop of Hippo in North Africa, heard the news and began working on a response, a vast, sprawling masterwork that would take him 13 years to complete. He called it the City of God. Its central argument was as simple as it was revolutionary: Rome was not eternal. No earthly city was eternal. The only eternal city was the City of God, the community of the faithful, existing beyond time, beyond politics, beyond the rise and fall of empires. It was the first great work of medieval Christian thought. And it was written, in part, as an attempt to make sense of the incomprehensible, the day that Rome fell silent. But Rome did not die in 410. That is the thing that surprises people. The sack of Alaric was devastating, psychologically more than physically. The city recovered. The population, which had fled in terror before the Visigoths arrived, gradually returned. The aqueducts still flowed. The markets reopened. The Senate still met. Life went on, in the particular way that life always goes on, stubbornly, quietly, regardless of what has happened. What could not recover was the idea. Because Alaric had proven something that could not be unproven. And other men, watching from beyond the borders, had taken note. If Rome could be entered, if those famous walls were not, in the end, impenetrable, then perhaps other things that had seemed permanent were also subject to revision. The Western Empire entered its final decades in a state of managed collapse. Emperors came and went with dizzying speed. In the 50 years between 425 and 476 AD, the Western throne changed hands 9 times. Some of these emperors were capable men trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Most were puppets, manipulated by whatever Germanic strongman happened to control the army that season. The real power in the late Western Empire was rarely the man wearing the purple. It was the general behind him, the Magister Militum, the master of soldiers, usually a Germanic warlord who found it more convenient to rule through a Roman figurehead than to claim the throne directly. One of those men was Flavius Aetius, perhaps the last truly great Roman general. He had spent part of his youth as a hostage among the Huns, learned their language, understood their tactics, formed a personal friendship with Attila's predecessor. When Attila finally turned his attention to the west in 450 AD, it was Aetius who organized the defense, a coalition of Romans and Visigoths and Franks and Burgundians, old enemies fighting side by side because the alternative was unthinkable. Attila. Even the name carries weight across 15 centuries. He was not tall. Contemporary descriptions suggest a man of modest physical stature, broad-chested, with a large head and small, deep-set eyes that seemed, to those who encountered him, to contain something unsettling. He did not need to be physically impressive. He had already built the largest empire that existed on earth at that moment, stretching from the Rhine to the borders of China. Kings sent him tribute. Emperors sent him gold. He had leveled cities. Nisus, the birthplace of the Emperor Constantine, was so thoroughly destroyed by Attila's forces that travelers passing through decades later reported that the plains around it were still white with human bones. He called himself the Scourge of God. And the people who survived his campaigns believed him. At the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 AD, somewhere in what is now northeastern France, Aetius and his coalition met Attila's Huns in one of the largest battles of the ancient world. The fighting was so intense, so catastrophic in its scale, that ancient sources speak of a river running red, of the dead piled so deep that survivors climbed the bodies to higher ground. The result was inconclusive. Attila withdrew, which was not a victory for Rome but was not a defeat either. The following year he invaded Italy, burning city after city, moving toward Rome itself. And then he stopped. He met with Pope Leo I, Leo the Great, at the banks of the river Mincio. What passed between them, no one knows. The Pope, traveling with no army, no weapons, only the authority of his office and whatever force of personality he possessed, somehow persuaded Attila to turn back. Medieval Christians would later say it was a miracle, that Attila had seen a vision of Saints Peter and Paul standing behind the Pope, ready to strike him down if he refused. The cynical explanation is more mundane. Attila's army was suffering from disease and supply problems, and an embassy from the Eastern Empire had just reminded him of profitable raiding opportunities closer to home. But the image endured, the Bishop of Rome standing between civilization and its destroyer, armed with nothing but faith. It was a preview of what the Church would become in the centuries ahead. Attila died the following year. Drunk at his own wedding feast, he suffered a massive hemorrhage in the night and drowned in his own blood. His empire, which had been built on his personal authority and terrifying reputation, dissolved almost immediately. His sons quarreled over the succession. The subject peoples rose in rebellion. Within a generation, the Hunnic Empire had vanished as completely as if it had never existed, leaving behind only bones in the grass and a collection of horror stories that would echo through European memory for 1,000 years. But the damage was done. The Germanic peoples that Attila had displaced were now settled within Roman territory. The military that had once defended the borders was hollowed out, dependent on barbarian federates whose loyalty was to their commanders rather than to Rome. The tax base had shrunk. The administrative machinery that had once coordinated the largest empire in the Western world was crumbling for lack of qualified people to run it, because the schools that trained administrators had closed, and the students who might have attended them were instead learning to survive in a world that had less and less use for Roman bureaucrats. In 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer looked at the Western Roman emperor, a 16-year-old boy named Romulus Augustulus, the son of a general who had placed him on the throne as a convenient puppet, and made a decision. Not to kill him. Not to replace him with another puppet. Simply to send him away. Romulus Augustulus was given a pension and a comfortable castle overlooking the Bay of Naples, and told that his services were no longer required. Odoacer did not bother to name a successor. There was no more Western Roman emperor, and almost no one, in that moment, seemed to notice. The silence that followed was not dramatic. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the fall of Rome, how undramatic it actually was. The people living through it did not experience it as a civilizational collapse. They experienced it as their particular lives, in their particular places, shaped by their particular circumstances. A farmer in what had been Roman Gaul did not wake on the morning after Odoacer's coup and think, "The ancient world is over." He thought about his crops, about the soldiers who had passed through last week, about whether the bridge over the river would hold through the winter, about his children. And yet the world had changed. The infrastructure began to fail, not all at once, but in the way that complex systems fail when the organizing intelligence that maintains them disappears. The aqueducts, those extraordinary feats of engineering, required constant maintenance, inspection, repair, the management of sluice gates and settling tanks and distribution networks. When the administrative apparatus that coordinated this maintenance dissolved, the aqueducts began to decay. Sections collapsed. Channels silted up. The flow diminished. And when the water stopped flowing, the cities that had depended on it could no longer support their populations. Rome itself, the city, not the empire, shrank. From perhaps 1 million people at its height to perhaps 20,000 by the 7th century. Those 20,000 lived among monuments built for 1 million, in a landscape of ruins so vast and so incomprehensible that medieval Romans developed elaborate mythologies to explain them. The Colosseum, they said, had been built by demons in a single night. The Pantheon had been constructed by the ancient giants. The vast, silent forums were the dwelling places of spirits. They could not imagine that human beings, people like themselves, had built these things. The scale exceeded their capacity for belief. And in that gap between what had been and what now was, the darkness settled. Literacy declined. Not disappeared. The Church maintained Latin literacy as a matter of religious necessity, since scripture and liturgy were in Latin. But the casual literacy of the Roman world, the graffiti scrawling, letter writing, contract-making literacy of a commercial urban culture, faded. Libraries that had once held hundreds of thousands of scrolls burned or decayed, or were simply abandoned, their contents scattered. The works of countless Roman writers, historians, philosophers, poets, scientists, vanished without trace. We know they existed because other writers mentioned them. We will never read them. Medicine retreated. The sophisticated Greco-Roman medical tradition, which had, for all its limitations, developed a reasonably empirical approach to the human body, was replaced by a mixture of prayer and folk remedy. Not because people became stupid, but because the institutions that had trained physicians, the medical schools of Alexandria and Pergamon, no longer functioned, and the texts they had used were no longer accessible to most practitioners. Engineering knowledge disappeared in the same way. The Romans had known how to make concrete, a specific formulation involving volcanic ash called pozzolana that produced a material harder and more water-resistant than anything the medieval world would produce for nearly 1,000 years. When the last Roman engineers died, they took that knowledge with them. The formula was not written down in any text that survived. And so the medieval world, standing amid the ruins of Roman concrete structures that had been standing for 5 centuries, could not figure out how to replicate them. They used Roman ruins as quarries, stripping the stone and brick for their own much smaller buildings, unable to imagine creating anything on that scale themselves. This is what is meant by the Dark Ages. Not a darkness of the spirit, not a darkness of human capacity or human worth. A darkness of information, of infrastructure, of the accumulated knowledge that makes complex civilization possible, knowledge that turned out to be far more fragile than the stone buildings it had produced. But in the monasteries, those communities of prayer and work that were beginning to spread across the landscape of former Roman Europe, something extraordinary was happening. The monks were not trying to save civilization. That is important to understand. The men who entered monastic communities in the 5th and 6th centuries were not archivists or historians or cultural preservationists. They were people seeking God. They withdrew from the world not because they wanted to preserve it but because they believed the world was passing away, that the second coming was imminent, that earthly kingdoms were irrelevant, that the only thing that mattered was the preparation of the soul for eternity. And yet, in withdrawing from the world, they saved it. The rule of Saint Benedict, written around 530 AD by a Roman nobleman turned monk named Benedict of Nursia, organized monastic life around a simple principle: ora et labora. Pray and work. The work included copying manuscripts. Not because Benedict was particularly interested in preserving classical literature, he was somewhat suspicious of pagan learning, but because copying was useful work, and the manuscripts that needed copying included scriptural texts, theological commentaries, liturgical books, and, almost incidentally, the works of Virgil and Cicero and Pliny and dozens of other classical authors that the monks needed as linguistic and rhetorical models for their own writing. And so, in the scriptoriums of Monte Cassino and Vivarium and Ba Bio and Luxeuil and Lindisfarne and 100 other monasteries scattered across the ruins of the Western Empire, monks bent over wooden desks by candlelight and copied. Day after day, year after year, decade after decade. Their fingers grew cramped. Their eyes strained in the dim light. The margins of their manuscripts are filled with small complaints. One monk wrote, in the margin of a theological text he was copying, that nothing is as exhausting as writing, that it makes your eyes weak, your spine ache, your ribs and belly sore. Another simply wrote, at the end of a long manuscript, "Thank God it will soon be dark." But they kept copying. Ireland became, in this period, one of the unexpected centers of learning in the Western world. The island had never been part of the Roman Empire. Roman armies had looked at it across the Irish Sea and decided it was not worth the effort. And so when Rome fell, Ireland did not fall with it. Irish monasteries developed a tradition of scholarship that was extraordinary for the age. Monks like Columba sailed to the island of Iona, off the western coast of Scotland, and established communities that became beacons of learning in a darkened world. It was in these Irish and Scottish scriptoriums that some of the most beautiful objects ever created by human hands were produced. The Book of Kells, a Gospel manuscript created around 800 AD, its pages covered in interlaced patterns of such complexity and precision that modern scholars studying it under magnification have discovered details invisible to the naked eye, details that a monk working by candlelight could not have seen and yet somehow produced, is not merely a religious text. It is a statement, a declaration, made in ink and pigment and gold leaf, that beauty still mattered. That the human capacity for wonder and artistry and patience had not been extinguished by the collapse of the world that had produced the Colosseum and the Pantheon. Meanwhile, in the former territories of the Western Empire, the political landscape was reshaping itself into something new. The Franks had established themselves in what had been Roman Gaul, the territory that would eventually become France, Belgium, and Western Germany. Under their king Clovis, who converted to Catholic Christianity around 496 AD, the Franks became the dominant power in the former Western provinces. Clovis's conversion was a political masterstroke as much as a spiritual event. By adopting Catholic Christianity rather than the Arian form that most other Germanic kings followed, he aligned himself with the Roman population of his kingdom and with the Pope in Rome, creating a partnership between Frankish military power and Roman ecclesiastical authority that would shape European history for centuries. The Visigoths ruled the Iberian Peninsula. The Ostrogoths controlled Italy under their remarkable king Theodoric, who had been educated in Constantinople and who made a genuine attempt to preserve Roman administrative traditions within his Gothic kingdom. In Britain, after the Roman legions withdrew in 410, a complex struggle played out between the remaining Romano-British population and waves of Anglo-Saxon settlers from what is now northern Germany and Denmark. A struggle that would eventually produce the patchwork of kingdoms whose names still echo in the English landscape: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex. These were not simply Roman institutions with Germanic faces. They were genuinely new things, hybrid cultures in the making, mixing Roman law and Germanic custom and Christian theology in proportions that varied by region and century, producing something that had never existed before and that would eventually, over the course of many generations, become what we call medieval Europe. The process was violent. Profoundly violent. These were centuries of raid and counter-raid, of shifting alliances and sudden betrayals, of fields burned and monasteries sacked and populations enslaved. Life expectancy was short. Infant mortality was staggering. Famine and plague moved through populations that had lost the infrastructure to resist them. And yet, people loved their children. They told stories by firelight. They fell in love and planted gardens and argued about theology with a passion that would seem comic if it were not so clearly sincere. The intellectual debates of the early medieval church, fierce controversies about the nature of Christ, about grace and free will, about the precise dating of Easter, these were not mere abstractions. They were the way that people in this era grappled with the deepest questions of existence. They were alive. Fully, completely, irreducibly alive. There was one man, in these dark centuries, whose story captures something essential about what it meant to stand at the hinge between the ancient world and the medieval, to be educated in the old way, to believe in the old values, and to watch them disappear. His name was Boethius. Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius was born around 480 AD, 4 years after the last Western Roman emperor was sent into exile, into one of the last truly Roman families. His ancestors had been consuls and senators going back centuries. He was educated in the classical tradition, in Greek philosophy and Latin rhetoric and mathematics and music theory. He was, by any measure, one of the most learned men of his age. He entered the service of Theodoric the Ostrogoth, the Germanic king who ruled Italy with a surprising degree of sophistication, and rose to become one of the most powerful officials in the kingdom. He was made consul. His 2 sons were made consuls simultaneously, an honor so extraordinary that it moved him to write one of the most beautiful passages in Latin literature, a description of watching his sons, both of them, seated in the chairs of the consulship, surrounded by the senators and the people of Rome, while he himself delivered the speech of thanksgiving. He wept, he wrote. He could not help it. And then everything collapsed. The exact details are disputed by historians. What is clear is this: Boethius was accused of treason, of conspiring with the Eastern Roman Emperor against Theodoric. Whether the accusations were true is unknown. Boethius denied them passionately, arguing that he had always acted in defense of the Senate and the Roman people. Theodoric, who was aging and increasingly paranoid, did not believe him, or chose not to. Boethius was arrested, stripped of his offices, and imprisoned in Pavia, in northern Italy, while Theodoric decided his fate. While he waited, in a prison cell, facing execution, everything he had built stripped away, Boethius wrote. He wrote The Consolation of Philosophy. It is, by any standard, one of the most extraordinary books produced in the ancient or medieval world. In it, he imagines the figure of philosophy herself appearing to him in his cell, a woman of indeterminate age, her garments torn by those who had tried to seize pieces of her over the centuries, her bearing regal, her expression both compassionate and severe. She comes to remind him of what he has forgotten: that fortune is by nature inconstant, that the wheel she turns raises men up and casts them down without malice or justice or any principle that human beings can fully comprehend. That the goods he has lost, wealth, power, status, the approval of the world, were never truly his to keep. That the only good that cannot be taken is the good within. He wrote this in a prison cell while waiting to be executed. He was executed in 524 AD, clubbed to death, some sources say, with particular brutality. He was perhaps 44 years old. The Consolation of Philosophy became one of the most widely read books in the medieval world. It was translated into Old English by King Alfred the Great, into Middle English by Geoffrey Chaucer, into French, into German, into Italian. For 1,000 years, people facing suffering and loss and the incomprehensible cruelty of fate reached for this book written by a man in a prison cell, in the last years of the ancient world, trying to understand why everything had gone wrong. Boethius is sometimes called the last Roman, the last man who was educated in the full classical tradition, who read Greek as easily as Latin, who had absorbed the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle not through summaries or translations but through the original texts. When he died, a direct line of intellectual transmission, stretching from Socrates through Plato through Aristotle through the great schools of Alexandria and Athens and Rome, was broken. It would not be fully restored for nearly 1,000 years, when Arab scholars who had preserved Greek philosophy in translation began to transmit it back to a Europe that had forgotten it. And yet the Consolation survived. Copied in those patient monastic scriptoriums, carried from monastery to monastery, translated and retranslated, it crossed the darkness that swallowed everything else and emerged on the other side still speaking, still asking the questions that Boethius had asked in his cell, still insisting that even in the worst of circumstances, something in the human being can remain undefeated. Somewhere in a monastery in Ireland, around the year 600 AD, a monk bent over a fresh sheet of vellum, scraped sheepskin, smooth and pale as cream, and dipped his quill in iron gall ink and began to copy. Outside, the wind came off the Atlantic, cold and salt-smelling, and the sea moved endlessly against the rocks. Inside, the candle threw its small circle of light against the stone walls. The monk's breath made faint mist in the cold air. He wrote, word after word after word, the sentences of men who had been dead for a century, 2 centuries, 5 centuries. He did not know their faces. He did not know their lives. He knew only their words, and he copied them, carefully, as if the act of copying were itself a kind of prayer. Perhaps it was. The Eastern Roman Empire, what later historians would call Byzantium, did not fall. From its capital at Constantinople, founded by the Emperor Constantine on the shores of the Bosphorus where Europe and Asia meet, it would continue for nearly 1,000 years after the West collapsed. Under the Emperor Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565 AD, it even briefly reconquered parts of the West, Italy, North Africa, southern Spain, in a last great attempt to restore the empire of Augustus and Trajan and Marcus Aurelius. The attempt ultimately failed. The territories were lost again within generations. But the effort demonstrated that the idea of Rome, the dream of a unified Mediterranean civilization under a single law, had not entirely died. It had simply moved east, changed form, become something new. And in the former western provinces, in the small kingdoms and the monastery gardens and the village churches built from Roman stone, something else was also becoming something new. Slowly, painfully, without any awareness of what it was becoming or any master plan to guide its development. The road that Rome had built still ran through the valley. The stones were worn now, cracked in places, weeds pushing up through the gaps. But it still ran. Still pointed somewhere. And people still walked along it, merchants with small loads, pilgrims heading toward distant shrines, messengers carrying letters between monasteries, armed men with purposes that were sometimes holy and sometimes terrible and sometimes both at once. Rome was gone. But the road remained. And somewhere, at the end of that road, the medieval world was waiting to be born. In the wreckage of the Roman world, one question haunted every king, every bishop, every warlord who scratched out a kingdom from the ruins. Who holds the center? Rome had been the answer for 8 centuries. One city, one emperor, one law, one administrative network that stretched from Scotland to Syria and told every corner of the known world what it was, where it stood, what it owed and to whom. When that center collapsed, the Western world did not simply change governments. It lost its organizing principle. And in the vacuum that followed, that long, violent, fragmented darkness of the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, dozens of small kingdoms rose and fell and rose again, each one claiming some fragment of Rome's authority, none of them large enough or stable enough to hold the whole. The Franks came closest. They had been there from the beginning, a Germanic people settled along the Rhine, fierce in battle, shrewd in politics, Catholic in religion since the conversion of their king Clovis in 496 AD. That conversion had been no small thing. Most of the other Germanic kings who carved up the Western Empire had adopted Arian Christianity, a form of the faith that Rome's church considered heretical, that denied the full divinity of Christ. Clovis chose differently. Whether from genuine conviction or cold political calculation, and with Clovis it was always difficult to separate the two, he was baptized into Catholic Christianity, aligning his kingdom with the Pope in Rome and with the Roman population of Gaul who still looked to the Church as the last institution connecting them to the civilization they had lost. It was a partnership that would shape Europe for 1,000 years. The Frankish kingdom grew. Under Clovis and his successors, the Merovingian dynasty, it expanded to absorb most of what had been Roman Gaul, modern France, Belgium, much of Western Germany, parts of Switzerland. But the Merovingians were unstable. Their custom of dividing the kingdom among all male heirs at a king's death meant that the realm was perpetually being split and reunited through war, assassination, and the particular brutality that characterized succession disputes among people who settled inheritance questions with axes. By the 7th century, the Merovingian kings had become figureheads, called, with a contempt so complete it had become simply descriptive, the Rois Fainéants, the do-nothing kings. The real power had shifted to the men who managed the royal household, the mayors of the palace. And in the early 8th century, one family of mayors of the palace had made that power hereditary. They were the Carolingians. And one of them, in 732 AD, did something that would change the course of European history. His name was Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. For nearly a century, the armies of Islam had been expanding with a speed and force that the world had not seen since the Huns swept out of the steppe 300 years earlier. In 632 AD, the Prophet Muhammad had died, and within a decade his followers had conquered the Persian Empire, swept through Syria and Egypt and North Africa, and crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into the Iberian Peninsula. The Visigoths who ruled Spain, that Germanic kingdom that had seemed so solid, collapsed in a matter of years. By 711 AD, Muslim armies controlled most of the peninsula and were looking northward. They crossed the Pyrenees. In 732 AD, a large Muslim force under Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi advanced deep into Frankish territory, moving toward Tours, one of the most sacred sites in Gaul, home to the shrine of Saint Martin, the soldier saint whose cloak had become one of the most revered relics in Christendom. Charles Martel met them somewhere between Tours and Poitiers, on terrain he had chosen carefully, with a Frankish army that had been drilled and disciplined in ways that Frankish armies rarely were. The battle lasted perhaps 2 days. Abdul Rahman was killed. His army withdrew. The advance stopped. Whether the Battle of Tours was truly the moment that saved Christian Europe, as later generations would insist, or whether it was simply one engagement in a long frontier struggle, historians still debate. What is not debated is what Charles Martel made of the victory. He used it. He used the prestige and the plunder and the momentum to consolidate Frankish power in a way that no previous mayor of the palace had managed. When he died in 741 AD, he left behind a Frankish kingdom that was the strongest military power in the former Western Roman Empire. He also left behind 2 sons. One of them was named Pepin. And Pepin had a son who would become the most important figure in European history between the fall of Rome and the rise of the modern nation-state. His name was Karl. The world would call him Charlemagne, Charles the Great. He was born around 742 AD. The exact date is uncertain, as are so many facts about a man whose life would be buried under centuries of legend almost before it was finished. What we know comes primarily from a single extraordinary source, a biography written by a man named Einhard, who served at Charlemagne's court, knew the king personally, observed him at close quarters for years, and wrote with the directness and detail that makes his account feel, across 12 centuries, almost startlingly immediate. Einhard describes a man of impressive physical presence. Tall by the standards of his era, perhaps 6 feet, which was extraordinary in the 8th century. Broad-shouldered, thick-necked, with a round face and large, expressive eyes. He walked quickly, with a slight limp in later life from a wound that never properly healed. He ate simply, disliked drunkenness, and was moderate in his drinking at a time when moderation at table was not a common virtue among Germanic kings. He swam, and swam well. The thermal springs at Aachen, which he would later make his capital, attracted him in part because they gave him the opportunity to swim, which he did almost daily when the springs were accessible, often with a large crowd of courtiers and friends in the water around him. He spoke Frankish as his native tongue and Latin fluently, the language of the church, of scholarship, of anything that aspired to civilization in the post-Roman world. He understood Greek but could not speak it easily. late in his life, perhaps embarrassingly late for a man who had built an empire on the ruins of Rome, he attempted to learn to write. Einhard records this with characteristic delicacy. The old king kept writing tablets under his pillow and practiced at night, when no one could see him struggle with the letters. He never fully mastered it. The hand that had wielded a sword through 50 years of warfare could not quite make the pen obey. But what Einhard's biography cannot capture, what no biography fully captures, is the quality that made Charlemagne, Charlemagne. It was not military genius, though he had that. It was not political cunning, though he had that too. It was something harder to name. A restless, consuming ambition that was not merely personal, not the ambition of a man who wants power for its own sake, but ideological. Charlemagne wanted to build something. He wanted to restore something. He wanted the Western world to have a center again, and he was willing to spend his entire life, 50 years of almost continuous warfare and administration, trying to provide one. His father Pepin had already taken the decisive step of making the Carolingian family's power legitimate in the eyes of the Church. In 751 AD, Pepin had the last Merovingian king, a man named Childeric, who had been a figurehead for years, shaved and sent to a monastery. He then appealed to Pope Zachary. Was it right, he asked, that the man who actually held power should be called merely mayor of the palace, while the man who held the title of king sat useless on his throne? The Pope's answer was essentially, no, that seems ridiculous. Pepin was anointed king of the Franks by the papal representative in Gaul, the first Frankish king to receive the sacred oil of royal consecration, a ritual borrowed from the Old Testament kings of Israel and heavy with theological implication. The Pope had, in effect, legitimized Pepin's coup. And in return, Pepin marched into Italy and gave the Pope a large chunk of territory that would become the Papal States, lands that the papacy would control, in one form or another, for over 1,000 years. The transaction was straightforward. The Church gives the king God's endorsement. The king gives the Church land and military protection. It was an arrangement of mutual convenience that both parties understood perfectly. And it was the arrangement that Charlemagne inherited, and expanded, and deepened, and transformed into something neither side had quite anticipated when it began. When Charlemagne became sole king of the Franks in 771 AD, following the death of his brother Carloman, a death that was convenient enough to generate rumors that Charlemagne had something to do with it, though nothing was ever proven, he was perhaps 29 years old. He had already been fighting for most of his adult life, at his father's side and then his own. He would continue fighting for the next 30 years. The campaigns that followed would reshape the map of Europe. The Saxons. If there is one conflict that defines the military dimension of Charlemagne's reign, it is the 30-year war against the Saxons, a Germanic people who lived in what is now northwestern Germany, who had no king, no central authority, no written law, and no Christianity. They were pagans who worshipped the old Germanic gods, Wotan and Thor and the rest of the pantheon that Christianity had been trying to displace for 3 centuries. They raided Frankish territory with regularity and retreated into their forests before a counterattack could be organized. They were, from Charlemagne's perspective, simultaneously a military problem and a theological one. The war began in 772 AD and did not end until 804 AD. 32 years. More than 50 campaigns. The Saxons would submit, receive baptism, swear loyalty, and the moment Charlemagne's army turned to deal with some other crisis on some other frontier, they would rise again, renounce their baptism, and murder the Frankish officials and Christian priests who had been installed among them. It happened again and again, with a repetition that would seem almost comic if it were not so bloody. The lowest moment came in 782 AD, at a place called Verdun on the Aller River. Following a Saxon uprising that had destroyed a Frankish army, Charlemagne gathered the leading men of the rebellion and had 4,500 of them beheaded in a single day. The massacre of Verdun is the darkest episode of Charlemagne's reign, an act of retributive violence so extreme that even sympathetic sources record it with a kind of stunned silence. Later historians would argue over what it meant, whether it represented a deliberate policy of terror, a loss of control in a moment of rage, a military calculation. What is clear is that it did not end the war. The Saxons kept fighting. And eventually Charlemagne found that violence alone would not accomplish what he needed. He had to offer something as well. He offered land. He offered law. He offered incorporation into the Frankish political system, which was brutal and exploitative, but which also brought roads and trade and the infrastructure of organized governance. He offered, in short, the same deal that Rome had once offered to the peoples it absorbed. Come inside the system. Accept the rules. And in exchange you will have peace and relative prosperity and the protection of the largest military force in the Western world. It worked. Eventually, the Saxons became Frankish subjects. They were baptized, genuinely this time, or at least durably, and the Christian faith took root in their territory in ways that would shape German history for centuries. Meanwhile, on other frontiers, other campaigns. In 773 AD, Pope Hadrian I appealed to Charlemagne for help against the Lombards, a Germanic people who had controlled northern Italy for 2 centuries and who were pressing on the territories around Rome. Charlemagne crossed the Alps, a logistical feat of remarkable ambition for an 8th century army, defeated the Lombard king Desiderius, and was crowned king of the Lombards. Italy, or at least the northern part of it, was now Frankish. In Spain, there was an attempt to push back the Muslim presence that had partial and mixed results, most famously producing the disaster at Roncesvalles Pass in 778 AD, where Charlemagne's rearguard was ambushed by Basques in the mountain pass, and the commander of that rearguard, a man named Roland, died fighting. Roland was a minor historical figure, but the story of his death, transformed by legend and romance over the following centuries, became the Song of Roland, one of the earliest and most beloved works of French literature, the beginning of the tradition of chivalric epic that would define medieval European culture for 300 years. In the east, Charlemagne fought the Avars, nomadic warriors from the steppe who had established a powerful kingdom in the middle Danube basin and who had been raiding into Frankish territory for years. The Avar campaigns of the 790s were among the most successful of Charlemagne's military career. The Avar kingdom was destroyed, its enormous accumulated treasure, centuries of tribute and plunder, captured and distributed among Charlemagne's followers in quantities so vast that contemporaries reported it had changed the price of goods across Europe. By the year 800 AD, Charlemagne ruled a territory larger than any European state since the Western Roman Empire. It stretched from the Pyrenees in the southwest to the Elbe River in the northeast, from the Atlantic coast of France to the borders of modern Hungary. It contained what would eventually become France, Germany, the Low Countries, Switzerland, Austria, and most of Italy. 40 years of warfare had assembled the most powerful political entity the Western world had seen in 3.5 centuries. And then, on Christmas Day, in the year 800 AD, something happened in Rome that neither Charlemagne nor the Pope had quite planned, and that both of them would spend years trying to decide how they felt about. He had come to Rome to deal with a crisis. Pope Leo III had been attacked in the streets of the city by a mob led by nephews of his predecessor, a brutal assault that had left him wounded and humiliated. He had fled to Charlemagne's court seeking protection, and Charlemagne had obliged, writing to Rome in the autumn of 800 AD to restore order and to preside over an assembly that cleared Leo of the charges his enemies had raised against him. It was meant to be a political visit, a demonstration of Frankish power in the service of papal authority. Nothing more. On Christmas Day, 800 AD, Charlemagne attended Mass at St. Peter's Basilica, the old basilica that Constantine had built over the tomb of the Apostle Peter 4.5 centuries earlier. The church was full. The ceremony proceeded. And then, at the moment of prayer, as Charlemagne knelt before the altar, Pope Leo III stepped forward and placed the crown upon his head. The congregation, apparently prepared for this moment, though Charlemagne apparently was not, erupted in acclamation. 3 times they shouted it, in the ancient Roman formula. To Charles, most pious Augustus, crowned by God, great and peace-giving emperor, life and victory. Charlemagne was emperor of the Romans. Or so the Pope declared. The legality of this act was, to put it gently, contested. There was already a Roman emperor, in Constantinople. The Eastern Empire had never recognized the West's collapse as permanent, had always considered itself the legitimate continuation of Roman Imperium. And there was a further complication. At the moment of Charlemagne's coronation, the throne of Constantinople was occupied by a woman, Irene, who had seized power by blinding and deposing her own son. This meant, by one reading of the situation, that the Roman throne was effectively vacant. Which meant that Leo's coronation of Charlemagne was not quite as legally absurd as it might otherwise have seemed. But Charlemagne's own reaction to the coronation was, according to Einhard, one of irritation. Einhard writes that Charlemagne declared he would not have entered the church that day, even though it was a great feast day, if he had known in advance what the Pope was planning to do. Historians have argued for centuries about what this means. Was it genuine surprise? Was it a political performance, the king who must appear reluctant to seize power? Was he irritated because the coronation implied that he received his imperial authority from the Pope, which would mean the Pope's authority was in some sense superior to his own? The third interpretation is the one most historians find persuasive. Charlemagne spent the rest of his reign carefully positioning himself as an emperor whose authority came from God directly, not from any earthly intermediary, including the Bishop of Rome. But whatever his feelings about how it happened, the fact itself he embraced completely. He was emperor. And he would spend the remaining 14 years of his reign, he died in 814 AD, trying to make that title mean something real. What he built was, in some ways, extraordinary. An administrative system that attempted to impose order on a territory so vast and so diverse that governing it at all was a constant logistical nightmare. The key institution was the Missi Dominici, the Lord's envoys. Pairs of royal officials, usually one cleric and one layman, who traveled in circuits through the empire, arriving unannounced in each county, investigating complaints, hearing appeals, checking that the local count was administering justice fairly and collecting taxes honestly and maintaining the roads and bridges that were his responsibility. They had full imperial authority. They could override local officials. They reported directly to Charlemagne. It was, in essence, a traveling audit system. And it worked, and perfectly, as all such systems work, with constant corruption and evasion. But it worked well enough that it represented a genuine administrative innovation. The idea that a central authority could project its power into local areas through mobile representatives, rather than relying entirely on fixed officials who would inevitably develop local interests, was one that later medieval governments would return to again and again. There was also the matter of law. The Frankish kingdom was a patchwork of different legal traditions: Frankish law, Lombard law, Roman law, Saxon law, the customary law of a dozen different peoples who had been absorbed into the empire at different times. Charlemagne attempted to codify and standardize. He issued capitularies, royal decrees that covered everything from the proper administration of justice to the management of royal estates to the education of the clergy. He was not creating a unified legal code on the Roman model. That was beyond the administrative capacity of his government. But he was moving in that direction, imposing a common framework of expectations, a common set of standards, on a territory that had been governed for 3 centuries by local custom and the arbitrary will of local strongmen. And then there was the Carolingian Renaissance. He could not write. But he understood, with a clarity unusual in a military king of the 8th century, that literacy and learning were not luxuries. They were infrastructure. A kingdom needed administrators who could read documents and write letters and keep accounts. A church needed clergy who could read scripture and conduct the liturgy correctly and instruct their congregations in the faith. A legal system needed judges who could interpret written law rather than simply following local custom. And all of these things required education, required schools, teachers, books, a common written standard that could transmit information reliably across the enormous distances of the Carolingian Empire. What Charlemagne found when he looked at the educational state of his realm was dismaying. The clergy, who were supposed to be the literate class, the people who kept records and wrote letters and administered the legal system on behalf of royal authority, were often barely literate themselves. There were priests who could not read the Latin of the Mass, who had memorized the words phonetically without understanding them. There were monks who copied manuscripts they could not comprehend. There were bishops who could barely sign their own names. Charlemagne was outraged. And outrage, with him, led to action. He gathered scholars. Not just Frankish scholars. There were few enough of those, but the best minds from every corner of the Christian world. From England came Alcuin of York, the finest scholar of the age, who became the director of the palace school at Aachen and Charlemagne's closest intellectual companion. From Italy came Peter of Pisa and Paulinus of Aquileia. From Ireland came scholars whose monasteries had preserved learning through the darkest centuries. From Spain came Theodulf, who would become one of the great poets of the Carolingian age. Alcuin in particular shaped what the Carolingian Renaissance became. He reformed the palace school, expanding it from an institution for training royal officials into something closer to a genuine center of learning, where not only the sons of nobles but talented boys from any background could receive an education. He standardized the curriculum, based on the classical trivium and quadrivium, the 7 liberal arts that Roman education had developed and that Carolingian scholars were now trying to recover and transmit. He corresponded with scholars across Europe, building a network of intellectual exchange that was, in the fragmented world of the 8th century, genuinely remarkable. And Alcuin did something with more lasting consequence than any of his scholarly work. He and his team of scribes developed a new form of handwriting. This sounds like a small thing. It was not. The script that had evolved in the various monasteries of the former Western Empire was a chaotic jumble. Different regions had developed different hands, different conventions, different abbreviations. A manuscript written in one scriptorium could be almost illegible to a scholar from another region. Information could not flow easily. Knowledge could not accumulate. And so Alcuin's scriptorium at Aachen, building on work that had already begun at Tours, developed Carolingian minuscule, a clear, standardized, legible script that separated letters, used both upper and lower case, and could be read by any educated person regardless of where they had been trained. When the humanists of the Renaissance, a full 6 centuries later, looked back at ancient manuscripts and tried to revive classical learning, the scripts they reached for as models, the scripts they believed were authentically Roman, were Carolingian minuscule manuscripts. They were 600 years old, not ancient. But they looked clean and rational and legible. The humanists based their own handwriting on them. And the humanist handwriting became the basis for the Roman typefaces that Gutenberg and his successors used in the first printed books. The letters on this page, the letters in virtually every printed text in the Western world, descend in direct lineage from the writing reform that Alcuin carried out at Charlemagne's court in the late 8th century. That is the kind of legacy that is easy to miss. It does not announce itself. It simply becomes the water in which everything else swims. Charlemagne's court at Aachen became, in these years, the most brilliant center of learning and culture in the Western world. Poets wrote verses in classical Latin. Scholars debated theology and philosophy. The king himself, that barely literate man who practiced writing under his pillow at night, gave his courtiers classical nicknames. He was David, the biblical king. Alcuin was Flaccus, after Horace. The court was called the New Athens. There was something almost touching about it. This enormous, violent, ambitious man, who had spent his life on horseback and battlefield, trying to create around himself the intellectual world he had never quite been able to enter himself. He loved learned conversation. He insisted on being read to at meals, usually from Augustine's City of God, that great meditation on the relationship between earthly and divine power that had been written in the aftermath of Rome's first sack. He fell asleep, I heard records, with the ease of a man whose conscience was clear, which suggests either genuine moral confidence or a remarkable capacity for self-deception, and with Charlemagne, it was sometimes hard to tell which. He died at Aachen in January 814 AD, of pleurisy, an inflammation of the lungs, after a life of extraordinary physical activity that had carried him across Europe dozens of times. He was perhaps 72 years old. For a man of his era, for a man who had led armies through 50 years of warfare, who had crossed the Alps multiple times and forded rivers in full armor and campaigned in the depths of winter, it was a remarkable lifespan. He had outlasted almost everyone who had known him young. He left behind an empire. And he left behind a problem. The problem was the same one that had doomed the Merovingians before him, the same one that had fractured Rome itself in its final centuries. What happens after the great man dies? Charlemagne's son Louis, called Louis the Pious, a nickname that tells you something both about his genuine religiosity and about the way his contemporaries saw him compared to his father, was a capable administrator and a genuinely devout Christian. He was not his father. He lacked the brutal, driving energy, the capacity for controlled violence, the instinct for the precise moment to be merciful and the precise moment to be terrifying, that had made Charlemagne irreplaceable. He was a man of peace trying to hold together an empire built by war. He had 3 sons from his first marriage, Lothair, Pepin, and Louis. And then, in a second marriage late in his reign, a 4th son, Charles, called Charles the Bald. The question of how to divide the empire among these heirs tore the court apart. Louis changed the succession plan multiple times, attempting to favor Charles at the expense of his older sons, triggering revolts that became almost farcical in their frequency. The older sons rebelling, being forgiven, rebelling again, being forgiven again. Louis was once publicly humiliated by his own sons and the bishops who supported them, forced to perform a public penance for sins he was not entirely sure he had committed, a scene so degrading for the imperial dignity that contemporaries recorded it with something approaching horror. He died in 840 AD, still trying to hold it together. 3 years later, his surviving sons signed the Treaty of Verdun, one of the most consequential documents in European history, though it looks, on the surface, simply like a property settlement between quarreling brothers. It divided the Carolingian Empire into 3 parts. Lothair received the Middle Kingdom and the imperial title. Louis, called Louis the German, received the Eastern territories, roughly what would become Germany. Charles the Bald received the Western territories, roughly what would become France. The line that the Treaty of Verdun drew between East Francia and West Francia in 843 AD is, with remarkable persistence, recognizable as the border between France and Germany today. Not exactly. Not in every detail. But the broad outline, the general division, the idea that there is a France and a Germany, that they are different things with different languages and different political traditions, has its origin in that document, signed by 3 brothers in a Frankish city over 1100 years ago. The Carolingian Empire as a unified political entity did not survive. It fragmented further in the generations after Verdun, as the successors of the three brothers proved unable to maintain even their portions against the pressure of new invasions. Vikings from the north, Magyars from the east, Saracens from the south. By the late 9th century, the empire that Charlemagne had built was gone. But what it had created did not disappear. The idea persisted. The idea that the Western Christian world should have an emperor, that there was a dignity called Roman Emperor that belonged to the ruler of the West, that this dignity was conferred by the Pope, that it connected its holder to the ancient legacy of Rome. This idea proved extraordinarily durable. In 962 AD, a German king named Otto I was crowned emperor by the Pope in Rome, and the entity he created, which would eventually receive the name Holy Roman Empire, would stagger on, in various forms, for 844 years, until Napoleon abolished it in 1806. It was not Rome. It was not Charlemagne's empire. It was something messier and stranger and more contested, an empire that was, as the 18th century writer Voltaire memorably observed, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But it was there. It occupied the conceptual space that Charlemagne had created. And it served, for century after century, as the frame within which European politics was conducted, the thing that every ambitious ruler either tried to control or tried to resist. The administrative tools that Charlemagne had developed, the Missi Dominici, the capitularies, the standardized script, the palace schools, became the template from which later medieval governments built their own systems. Not directly, not without enormous transformation, but the direction had been set. The idea that a king had obligations to administer justice, to maintain roads, to educate the clergy, to protect the church, and not merely rights, was a Carolingian idea. The idea that royal authority could be made legible through documents, through written laws and written records and written correspondence, was a Carolingian idea. And the Carolingian Renaissance, that remarkable flowering of learning at Aachen and Tours and Fulda and the dozen other centers that Charlemagne and his successors had created, had preserved and transmitted a body of classical learning that would otherwise have been lost. The manuscripts copied in Carolingian scriptoriums are among our primary sources for classical Latin literature. Without them, without the culture of copying and preservation that Charlemagne's court had fostered, the Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries would have had far less to revive. He was buried at Aachen, in the cathedral he had built, that extraordinary octagonal chapel, modeled on the Byzantine church of San Vitale in Ravenna, that still stands today. His throne, a simple marble seat assembled from pieces of Roman stone, still sits in the gallery above the altar. Pilgrims came to visit his tomb for centuries. Kings came to be crowned beside it. Frederick Barbarossa canonized him in 1165 AD, a politically motivated canonization, but a canonization nonetheless. Saint Charlemagne, Charles the Great, the father of Europe. Whether he deserves that title depends, perhaps, on what you think Europe is. If it is the sum of its violence, the conquest and forced conversion and the massacre at Verdun, then Charlemagne is its father in a dark sense, the founder of a tradition of holy war and coerced conformity that would produce the Crusades and the Inquisition and centuries of religious persecution. If it is the sum of its aspirations, the schools and the scripts and the laws and the dream of a unified civilization governed by reason and faith, then he is its father in the sense that his admirers intended. Most likely he is both. Most likely the violence and the vision cannot be separated, because they came from the same source, that restless, consuming ambition to build a center in a world that had lost one, to impose order on chaos, to make the Western world cohere around a single idea of what it should be. He did not succeed finally. The empire broke apart. The center did not hold. But the attempt, that long, bloody, brilliant, terrible attempt, left marks on the world that have not faded in 1200 years. The roads he paved still carry traffic. The script his scholars developed still shapes the letters on every page. The border his grandsons drew still, in some form, divides nations. And in the cathedral at Aachen, in the cold light that falls through Byzantine-style windows onto marble floors that Frankish craftsmen laid in the 8th century, the ghost of his ambition still moves. Something enormous had tried to pull the broken world back together. It had failed. And in failing, it had made the medieval world. There is a moment, somewhere in the middle of the 9th century, when the world that Charlemagne had tried to hold together finally lets go. Not with a single catastrophic event. Not with a battle or a treaty or a coronation gone wrong. Simply a slow, grinding loosening, like a rope under too much tension, fraying strand by strand until one morning you reach for it, and it is gone. From the north came the Vikings. From the east came the Magyars. From the south came the Saracens. 3 directions. 3 different peoples. 3 different ways of fighting and raiding and appearing without warning from beyond the horizon. The Carolingian administrative system, those missi dominici traveling their circuits, those capitularies imposing royal standards on local counts, had been designed for a world at relative peace, a world where the empire's enormous military machine could project force to any threatened point. It had not been designed for simultaneous attack from 3 directions at once, for raids that materialized and vanished before a Frankish army could respond, for the particular terror of enemies who did not want to conquer territory but simply to take everything worth taking and disappear back into the sea or the steppe. The Vikings moved down rivers that no one had thought of as invasion routes: the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, the Thames. They appeared before Paris in 845 AD and extracted a payment of 7,000 pounds of silver to go away. They appeared again. And again. The Frankish kings, those diminished successors of a diminished Charlemagne, quarreling over fragments of a divided empire, could not stop them. The imperial center could not protect the periphery. And so the periphery stopped looking to the center for protection. What happened next was not planned. It was not designed by any philosopher or legislated by any king. It grew from necessity, from the simple, desperate human need for someone who could actually protect you when men with axes arrived at the edge of your field. It grew into feudalism. And feudalism grew its own warrior class. A class defined not by birth alone, not by wealth alone, but by a particular combination of both, and by something harder to define, something that the medieval world would spend centuries elaborating into an entire moral system, an entire code of what it meant to be human at the highest level. They called it chivalry. And the men who embodied it, or tried to, or pretended to, or aspired to in their better moments, were the knights. To understand what a knight was, you have to understand what the 9th century felt like from the ground. Imagine you are a farmer. Your family has worked this land for 3 generations, the same fields, the same village, the same rhythm of planting and harvest that has defined your world since before you were born. You have heard stories of Charlemagne, the way all people in this part of the world have heard stories of Charlemagne, vast, legendary stories about a king who was also almost a god, who held the world together by sheer force of will. But Charlemagne is 30 years dead. His grandsons have divided his empire into pieces too small to defend themselves. The count who is supposed to protect your village lives 3 days' ride away and has his own problems. And one morning, before the harvest is in, you hear the sound that every village in northern France has learned to dread, the creak of oars, the splash of a shallow drafted boat running up onto the riverbank, and then the voices, speaking a language you don't understand, getting louder. What saves you, if you are saved, is not the count, not the king, not any of the structures of Carolingian governance that are supposed to exist for exactly this purpose. What saves you is the man in the iron helmet at the edge of the village, the man on the horse, the man with the sword and the lance and the years of training that have made him something other than an ordinary human being in combat. What saves you is the local lord, the castellan, the knight. and so you give him something in return. You give him a portion of your harvest. You give him labor on his land. You give him, in a transaction that is never formally negotiated because both parties understand it perfectly without negotiation, a portion of your freedom. He protects you. You sustain him. The deal is ancient, older than Rome, older than civilization itself, but the particular form it takes in 9th and 10th century Europe has a name: feudalism. The word itself is a later invention. Medieval people did not walk around describing their social system as feudalism any more than people in the 21st century walk around describing theirs as capitalism. It was simply the way things worked. The way things had to work, given the circumstances. At the top of the pyramid sat the king, or the emperor, in theory, though by the 10th century imperial authority was a frayed and contested thing. Below the king were the great lords, dukes and counts and margraves, who held their lands directly from the king in exchange for military service. Below them were lesser lords, barons, knights of higher status, castellans, who held their lands from the great lords in exchange for the same. And at the bottom, the foundation on which the whole structure rested, were the peasants, the villeins and serfs and free farmers who worked the land and produced the food that fed everyone above them. The key transaction at each level was the same. The lord gave land, or more precisely, gave the use of land, the right to extract its produce, and in exchange received loyalty and military service. The ceremony that formalized this transaction was called homage. The vassal knelt before his lord, placed his hands between the lord's hands, and swore an oath of fealty. The Lord raised him up and gave him a symbolic token of the land he was being granted, a clod of earth, a twig, a ring. It was a deeply personal relationship, sealed by physical touch and sacred oath, rooted in the Germanic tradition of the warband, the comitatus, in which warriors pledged personal loyalty to a chief and expected personal generosity in return. It was also profoundly inefficient as a system of government. Because land once granted was hard to take back. Because loyalty, sworn to a person rather than to an institution, did not automatically transfer to that person's heir. Because a powerful lord with many vassals was not necessarily loyal to the king above him. Indeed, might be strong enough to challenge the king if the circumstances were right. The history of medieval Europe is substantially the history of kings trying to reassert control over mighty lords who had grown too powerful on the land and the rents the king's ancestors had given their ancestors. But in the 9th and 10th centuries, when the system was taking shape, these were problems for a later generation. The immediate problem was survival. And the solution that feudalism offered, however crude, however exploitative, however riddled with violence and injustice, was better than nothing. It was local. It was immediate. When the Vikings came up the river, you did not wait for a message to travel 3 weeks to a distant capital and an army to travel 3 more weeks back. You rang the church bell and ran to the castle, and the man with the sword came out to meet the threat. The castle itself was new. The early medieval world had not built castles in the way we imagine them, those towering stone keeps with their concentric rings of walls and their drawbridges and their gatehouses that we associate with the Middle Ages. Those came later. The first castles of the feudal era were simpler, rougher things, motte and bailey castles, built from wood and earth, constructed in days rather than years. A motte was a raised mound of earth. On top of it sat a wooden tower, the keep, the last refuge. Around the base of the mound was a bailey, an enclosed courtyard where the lord's household lived and worked. Surrounding everything was a wooden palisade and perhaps a ditch. It was not impressive by later standards, but it was enough. A small garrison of trained warriors in a wooden tower on top of an earthen mound could hold off a raiding party for hours, long enough for the raiders to decide that the cost was not worth the plunder, that there were easier targets elsewhere. The castle was not primarily an offensive weapon. It was a statement of permanence. A declaration that this land had a defender, that this lord was not going away, that attacking here had consequences. Across the landscape of 10th century Europe, these wooden towers began to appear on every hilltop and river bend. Thousands of them. Each one the center of a small world, a lord's household, a village of dependent peasants, a parish church, a mill, a smithy. Each one self-sufficient in the way that the Carolingian Empire had never needed its parts to be self-sufficient. Each one, in its rough wooden way, an assertion that order was possible even when the world outside had gone dark. And in each one, a warrior. Not just any warrior. The mounted warrior, the man on horseback, had become, through the bitter experience of the Viking and Magyar raids, the decisive military technology of the age. The Vikings could be met in the field by infantry, but infantry could not catch them when they ran. The Magyars, those lightning-fast horsemen from the eastern steppe, could simply ride around infantry formations, shooting from horseback, refusing to engage at close quarters until they chose. What was needed was cavalry. Fast cavalry. Cavalry that could pursue a raiding party back to its boats, that could match the Magyars' mobility, that could cover the ground between castle and village quickly enough to matter. The problem was that cavalry was expensive. A horse suitable for war, a destrier, a proper war horse, cost the equivalent of several years of a peasant family's income. The armor that made a mounted warrior effective, the mail hauberk, the helmet, the shield, cost as much again. The weapons. The years of training required to fight effectively from horseback, to control a terrified animal in the chaos of battle while simultaneously managing a lance and a sword. The squires and servants needed to maintain the equipment and the horse. The land required to support all of this. Only a person with land could afford to be a knight. And so the mounted warrior and the land-holding lord became, over the course of the 9th and 10th centuries, the same person. The knight was not merely a soldier. He was a social class. A way of being in the world. And being in the world in that particular way, with that particular combination of violence and property and sacred oath, required, eventually, a moral framework. A way of understanding what you were and what you owed to the world and what the world owed to you. That framework took centuries to develop. But it began in the training. A boy who was to become a knight did not simply learn to fight. He began learning to fight, but the process was embedded in something larger, a structure of service and apprenticeship that was designed, whatever its other effects, to form a particular kind of human being. Or at least to try. At the age of 7 or 8, the son of a knight or a nobleman would be sent away from his family's household to serve in the household of a greater lord, often a relative, often a powerful neighbor, sometimes a distant liege lord of high status. This was not cruelty, though it might look like it to modern eyes. It was education. The child would serve as a page, running errands, attending at table, learning the basic courtesies of aristocratic life, absorbing by observation and imitation the behavioral codes that define the warrior class. He would also begin physical training. Nothing so systematic as a modern sports program, more a constant background of physical activity, of riding and wrestling and running and the handling of weapons scaled to a child's size. By the time he was 14 or so, he would become a squire, the personal attendant of a knight, responsible for maintaining his lord's armor and weapons, for tending his horses, for accompanying him in battle and being there to help him to his feet if he fell, to hand him a fresh weapon if his broke, to guard him if he was wounded. The squire watched everything. He watched how his knight behaved in battle and in court. He watched how he treated his lord and his inferiors and the women of the household. He watched how he ate, and how he prayed and how he bore defeat. He was learning not just skills but character, or rather, he was learning a performance of character, a set of behaviors that the culture around him identified as the proper expression of what a knight was. Sometime between 15 and 21, the age varied enormously, the squire would be made a knight. The ceremony was called dubbing. In its simplest form, it was brief and military, a senior knight striking the candidate on the shoulder with a sword or the flat of a hand, a gesture whose meaning was obscure even to medieval people who debated it extensively, and the candidate rising as a knight. In more elaborate versions, it involved an all-night vigil in a church, prayer and fasting, a ritual bath, the putting on of new white garments symbolizing purity, the girding on of the sword as a sacred responsibility, and a mass at which the new knight received communion and dedicated himself to the service of God, his Lord, and the protection of the weak. The elaborate version was an ideal. Most dubbing ceremonies were the simple version, conducted on the battlefield before an engagement, when a commander needed more knights quickly and could not afford the luxury of a knight's prayer and a new set of white linen. But the ideal mattered. The ideal was where chivalry lived. The word itself comes from the French cheval, horse. A chevalier was a horseman. Chivalry was, at its origin, simply the code of the horse warrior. But in the hands of the church, and the poets, and the increasingly sophisticated culture of the high medieval court, it became something far more elaborate. It became a complete moral system, an answer to the question of what made a man good, specifically a man with a sword and a horse and the power of life and death over those around him. The church had a particular interest in shaping this code. For the church, the knight was a theological problem as much as a social one. Violence was a sin. War caused suffering. The men who fought, who killed, who burned, who plundered, were engaging in activities that put their souls at serious risk. The Crusades, which we will come to, were partly the Church's answer to this problem. Give these warriors something to fight for that was sanctified, a war in which the killing was holy rather than sinful. But even before the Crusades, the Church had been working on the problem of the warrior class. The Peace of God movement, beginning in the late 10th century, was one approach. Councils of bishops and abbots gathered great crowds of people, nobles and knights and peasants together, and proclaimed that certain places and certain people were off limits for violence. Churches and monasteries were sanctuaries. Clergy and monks and nuns were protected. Women were protected. Pilgrims were protected. The poor were protected. Anyone who violated these protections was threatened with excommunication, the most terrifying weapon in the ecclesiastical arsenal, the cutting off of a Christian from the sacraments, from the community of the faithful, potentially from salvation itself. The truce of God followed, proclamations that fighting was forbidden on certain days. Sundays, holy days, the seasons of Advent and Lent. In theory, if all these prohibitions were observed, there would have been very little time left in the year for war at all. In practice, they were violated constantly. But the violation was noted. It was wrong. The knight who fought on Sunday knew he was doing something wrong, even if he did it anyway. And that knowledge, that sense of transgression, of falling short of a standard, was itself a shaping force. The ideal knight, as it emerged from this mixture of church teaching and courtly culture and the practical experience of warfare, was a figure of startling complexity. He was, first and most fundamentally, a warrior. Prowess, was the first and most essential knightly virtue. Without it, everything else was empty. A brave man who was unkind was still a knight, after a fashion. A kind man who was a coward was nothing, worse than nothing, because he held a sword and could not use it, which made him a danger rather than a protection to those who depended on him. The physical courage required to charge at an enemy on horseback, to stand your ground when everything in your body was screaming at you to run, to keep fighting when you were wounded and exhausted and frightened, this was not something that could be faked or compensated for by other virtues. It had to be real. But prowess alone made a monster. History was full of men of extraordinary physical courage who used it in the service of nothing but themselves, who terrorized the weak, plundered the defenseless, broke their oaths the moment keeping them became inconvenient. The knightly code existed, in part, to channel prowess, to give it direction, to attach it to obligations. Loyalty. To your lord, to your king, to your comrades in arms, to the oaths you had sworn in the ceremony of homage. The feudal system ran on loyalty in the way that a machine runs on oil. Without it, the whole thing seized and stopped. A knight who broke his oath was not merely a criminal. He was a category error, a thing that should not exist, a contradiction in terms. The ceremony of degradation, applied to knights who had violated their oaths catastrophically, was one of the most powerful symbolic acts the medieval world possessed. The knight was stripped of his spurs, those gilded spurs that were the mark of his status, stripped of his sword, stripped of his armor, piece by piece, while a herald proclaimed his crimes. Sometimes the ceremony included a mock funeral. The degraded knight was carried on a bier to the church, his coat of arms reversed and defaced, and a death mass sung over him while he still lived. He was, in a real sense, dead. The social person who had been a knight no longer existed. Courtesy. The behavior appropriate to a court, a term that comes from the same root as courtesy, meaning the particular behaviors that the space of the Lord's court demanded. To be courteous was to know how to behave in company, how to speak to those above and below you, how to eat and dance and converse in ways that marked you as civilized rather than merely powerful. It was also, in the literature of the period, bound up inextricably with a particular understanding of love. Courtly love, fin amour, as the troubadours called it in the language of southern France, was perhaps the most peculiar cultural invention of the high medieval period. It was a code of love as elaborate and rule-governed as the code of war. The knight loved a lady. Not his wife. Typically, marriage in the aristocratic world was a property transaction, arranged by families, governed by considerations of land and alliance. The lady of courtly love was usually the wife of someone else, often the knight's own lord. The love was supposed to be, if not entirely chaste, then at least conducted with extreme discretion and self-restraint. The point was not sexual fulfillment. The point was the elevation of the lover, the way that the discipline of love, the suffering of unrequited desire, the effort to make oneself worthy of a great lady's regard, refined and improved the knight's character. It sounds, to modern ears, either absurd or hypocritical. And there is truth to both reactions. The courtly love tradition was partly a game, a sophisticated aristocratic entertainment, an excuse for poetry and music and the pleasurable danger of intrigue at court. But it also reflected something genuine about the medieval understanding of love as a transformative force. The idea that passion, properly directed and properly suffered, could make a person better. The troubadours spread this idea across southern France and then all of Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries. Poet-musicians who performed at aristocratic courts, composing lyrics of extraordinary sophistication about love and longing and the service of a distant, exalted lady. Figures like Guillaume IX of Aquitaine, Bernard de Ventadorn, the Countess of Dieu, writing in the Occitan language of the South, developing a tradition of lyric poetry that would eventually, through the Italian poets of the 13th century, lead to Dante and Petrarch and the entire tradition of European love poetry. Largesse. Generosity. The knight was supposed to give freely, to his followers, to the poor, to the church, to the travelers who passed through his lands. Hoarding was shameful. The great lord was the great giver. The feast in the hall, the gifts to departing guests, the charity to monasteries and hospitals, these were not merely nice things to do. They were obligations of status. They demonstrated that the Lord's power was real and abundant, that his lands produced enough to be shared, that he was not afraid of diminishment. The warrior who clung to every coin was not merely stingy, he was weak. And finally, piety, the duty to God. The knight was a Christian warrior, and his Christianity was not decorative. He was supposed to attend Mass regularly, to confess his sins, to take communion, to endow churches and monasteries, to protect the clergy and the pilgrims and the poor. He was supposed to fight for the faith when called, which, from the late 11th century onward, meant the Crusades. His violence was supposed to be in the service of something larger than himself. These virtues, prowess, loyalty, courtesy, generosity, piety, formed the skeleton of chivalry. They were taught in the training of the page and the squire. They were celebrated in the literature of the court. They were enforced, imperfectly and inconsistently, by the social pressures of aristocratic community and by the ever-present threat of ecclesiastical sanction. And they were, of course, violated constantly. The gap between the ideal of chivalry and the reality of medieval warfare was vast enough to swallow entire generations. The knight of the romances, Lancelot, Gawain, Perceval, Roland, existed in a world of perfect moral clarity, where virtue was rewarded and vice punished, and the right course of action was always, eventually, discernible. The knight of the actual battlefield existed in a world of mud and blood and screaming horses, and the particular moral confusion of trying to maintain a code of honor while doing things that the code itself acknowledged were terrible. War in the high medieval period was extraordinarily destructive. Not primarily the set-piece battle between armored knights that the romances celebrated. Those were actually relatively rare, because battles were costly and unpredictable and sensible commanders preferred to avoid them when possible. More common was the chevauchée, the mounted raid, designed not to defeat an enemy army but to devastate his territory. Burning villages, destroying crops, killing livestock, reducing the economic base that supported enemy military power. It was effective strategy. It was also catastrophic for the peasants who lived in the raided territory, who had no part in the political disputes that had brought foreign horsemen to their fields, and who bore the full weight of a war they could not influence. The knights who conducted chevauchées were not, by the standards of their own time, doing anything wrong. They were doing their jobs. The code of chivalry applied primarily in dealings between knights, between members of the same social class, who were bound by the same oaths and the same expectations. The peasant was outside this system. He was property, in a sense, a resource to be managed, a labor supply to be protected when useful and expended when necessary. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of chivalry. It was, for all its beauty and its genuine moments of mercy and restraint, a class code. It governed the behavior of knights toward other knights, and toward those above them in the hierarchy. It offered some protection to women, clergy, and other specified categories of the vulnerable. For everyone else, the overwhelming majority of the population, the farmers and craftsmen and servants who made the knightly world possible, it offered very little. And yet there were moments. There are always moments, in any moral system, where the ideal reaches through and touches the real. Where a knight did spare a beaten enemy when he had every incentive to kill him. Where a lord did intervene to protect peasants from soldiers who were supposedly on his own side. Where the code was honored not because anyone was watching but because the man who held it had internalized it deeply enough that violating it would have felt like a violation of himself. These moments are scattered through the historical record, in chronicles, in letters, in the accounts of prisoners who were treated with unexpected consideration, of towns that were spared when they might have been sacked. They do not redeem the system, but they testify to something, to the genuine power of ideals, even imperfect ones, even ones honored more in the breach than in the observance. The tournament was, in many ways, chivalry and microcosm, both its glory and its contradictions on full display. Tournaments had begun in the 11th century as training exercises, controlled melees in which groups of knights fought each other across open countryside, practicing the teamwork and individual skills they would need in actual battle. They were extraordinarily dangerous. The weapons were real, the horses were real, the armor was real, and men died regularly. The Church condemned them repeatedly, forbidding Christian burial to those who died in tournaments. The prohibition was ignored with cheerful consistency. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the tournament had evolved into something more elaborate, a social event as much as a military one. Stands for spectators. Heralds announcing the combatants by their coats of arms, those brightly colored heraldic devices that were becoming the visual language of aristocratic identity across Europe. Ladies watching from the gallery, their favors tied to the lances of their champions. Jousting, the individual mounted combat between two knights that had developed from the melee, becoming the centerpiece of the event, governed by increasingly elaborate rules designed to make the spectacle more exciting while marginally reducing the death rate. The tournament was theater. It was entertainment. It was a marriage market, a political meeting, a place to display wealth and courage and the heraldic identity of a noble house. It was also the place where the ideals of chivalry were performed most publicly, most consciously, most self-awarely, where the knight was most clearly playing the role of knight, aware that he was being watched and judged by exactly the standards the code prescribed. And in that performance, something interesting happened. The ideals shaped the reality. The man who spent years performing the role of a chivalrous knight, in tournaments, in courtly entertainments, in the rituals of homage and fealty, eventually became, in some measure, the thing he had been pretending to be. The performance and the character converged. Not always. Not completely. But enough to matter. This is how moral cultures work. Not through the consistent, perfect embodiment of ideals. That never happens, in any culture, at any time. But through the steady pressure of aspiration on behavior, the way that the gap between what we say we are and what we actually do generates a constant, uncomfortable demand for improvement. Chivalry said, a knight protects the weak. And some knights, hearing this, protecting nobody, felt the gap between what they were and what they said they were, and it troubled them. And some of those knights, troubled enough, did something about it. That is not nothing. In a violent world, that is quite a lot. The literature of chivalry was not separate from the code. It was the code's most powerful instrument of transmission. The romances, those long narrative poems and prose tales that spread across Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries, carrying the stories of Arthur and his Round Table, of Lancelot and Guinevere, of Perceval and the Holy Grail, of Tristan and Isolde, were not merely entertainment. They were moral instruction in the most enjoyable possible form. They showed what a knight should be, and they showed it with a specificity and an emotional intensity that no sermon or legal code could match. The Arthurian tradition had deep roots, in Welsh legend, in the memory of a post-Roman British leader who had resisted the Anglo-Saxon invasion, in the particular hunger of a fragmented world for stories of unity and lost greatness. But it was the French writers of the 12th century who transformed these scattered fragments into the great edifice of Arthurian romance. Chrétien de Troyes, writing at the court of the Countess of Champagne in the 1170s and 1180s, created the essential versions of the Lancelot story, the Grail story, and the Yvain story, tales in which the quest structure and the courtly love convention and the exploration of chivalric virtue were combined into a narrative form of extraordinary sophistication. The Round Table was the key image. No head. No foot. Every seat of equal honor, or rather, of equally high honor, because the men who sat at it were by definition the greatest knights in the world. It was a radical image for a society organized around strict hierarchy, around the precedence of the high seat and the low seat and the endless gradations of status that governed who stood where and ate what at every aristocratic gathering. At the Round Table, the hierarchy dissolved into brotherhood. The knights were equal not in rank but in virtue, bound not by feudal obligation but by shared commitment to the code. It was, of course, an impossible ideal. The stories themselves know this. The Arthurian romances are full of failure, of knights who fall short, who give in to pride or lust or cowardice, who betray their lord and their fellowship for love or ambition. Lancelot, the greatest of all the knights, is the one whose failure is most catastrophic. His love for Guinevere, the queen, the king's wife, is the crack in the foundation that eventually brings the whole edifice down. The tragedy of Arthur is not the tragedy of a bad man. It is the tragedy of a good man whose good men could not quite be good enough, whose ideal was too perfect for the world that had to contain it. This is, perhaps, the deepest thing that chivalric literature understood about itself. At the same time that these literary ideals were being elaborated and refined, the physical reality of knightly warfare was changing. The castle had been evolving throughout the 11th and 12th centuries, from those crude motte-and-bailey structures of the early feudal period to the formidable stone fortresses that began to appear across Europe, and famously, across the Holy Land in the wake of the Crusades. The stone keep was the first development, a massive square or round tower of cut stone, positioned on the highest point of available terrain, with walls thick enough to resist siege engines and a floor plan designed to maximize defensive advantage. Each floor accessible only through a single narrow stair that could be defended by one man against many. Doorways low and narrow, so that a man entering had to bow his head and reduce his profile. Windows little more than arrow slits. Then the curtain wall, the outer defensive perimeter of cut stone, replacing the wooden palisade, with towers at intervals allowing archers to cover the approaches to every stretch of wall. Then the gatehouse, that elaborate complex of portcullis and drawbridge and murder holes through which defenders could pour boiling water or molten lead onto attackers attempting to force the entrance. Then the inner bailey and the outer bailey, creating concentric rings of defense so that capturing the outer wall merely put an attacker inside another fortress rather than at the end of his difficulties. The great Crusader castle Croix de Chevaliers, built by the Knights Hospitaller in Syria in the 12th century, represents something close to the ultimate development of this tradition, a concentric fortress of such sophistication that the Arab chronicler Ibn Jubair called it the most formidable castle in the world. Its walls were 20 feet thick in places. It could house 2,000 soldiers and supply itself from its own granaries for 5 years without resupply. It fell eventually, in 1271, but only after the Crusader presence in the Holy Land had already effectively collapsed around it. The tournament, the romance, the castle, 3 expressions of the same culture, the same attempt to impose form and meaning on the violent world that feudalism had created. Each one a kind of architecture. The castle was the architecture of defense, the physical expression of the Lord's power and permanence. The tournament was the architecture of performance, the ritual space in which the knight's identity was displayed and validated. The romance was the architecture of aspiration, the imaginary space in which the code was perfectly embodied and the gap between ideal and reality temporarily dissolved. None of them was sufficient. Together, they were the medieval world's most sustained attempt to answer a question that every complex civilization must eventually face. What do you do with your warriors? How do you take the violent energy that protects your society and also threatens it, and shape it into something that serves rather than destroys? Chivalry was not a perfect answer. It was not even a good answer, by the standards of most of the people who lived in medieval Europe. The peasants who bore the weight of feudal extraction, the Jews and heretics who fell outside the code's protections entirely, the women whose elevation in courtly love was inseparable from their subordination in law and custom. But it was an attempt. A sustained, sincere, centuries-long attempt to make the sword serve something larger than itself. And in the literature it produced, in the stories of Arthur and Lancelot, of Roland and Oliver, of the Grail and the Round Table, it left behind something that has outlasted every castle and every armor, every dynastic war and every feudal obligation. It left behind an idea of what a human being might be at their best. Brave without cruelty. Loyal without blindness. Generous without calculation. Tender toward the weak. Honest before the powerful. No one fully embodied it. Everyone who tried was shaped by trying. That, perhaps, is enough. The age of the night was also, always, the age of the dreamer, the person who looked at the violent, unjust, beautiful world around them and imagined it better, and in imagining it better, made it, by some small fraction, more nearly so. And in the cold keeps and the bright tournament fields, in the smoky halls where troubadours sang of love and loss, in the scriptoriums where monks copied Arthurian tales between prayers, in all these places, that imagination was alive. It was far from dead yet.
you.